When you're building out web pages, you're going to want to make sure that your code is set up correctly. Now, sometimes when you make errors in the code, you will be able to see the problems right away in the rendered version of your web page. But sometimes the errors are going to be a little bit more tricky and you won't be able to find them. So here is the page that we're working on, this bird watchers page right here. And if we look at this in the web page at first glance, it probably looks pretty good. You may notice down at the bottom of the page, there is some kind of strange things happening. One of the things is where it says email us for help. This copyright is also a link. So that might be a visual indication that there is some sort of problem. And then this copyright, this should actually be the copyright symbol. So that again is problematic. There are some other errors on this page that are not appearing visually in the page. So just because the page looks okay, it still might have some issues, and we're going to want to be able to discover what those are. Here's the HTML that I'm using for the page that we were just looking at. And again, you may be able to look through the page and identify where some errors are, but some of the errors might not be visually apparent upon first glance. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to validate our code. And this is a really important step on any web page that you're building. You're going to want to validate your code. Now, the page that I'm currently working on is an XHTML document. If you are working with an HTML5 document, you will use a slightly different validator, and I'll show you that at the end of this particular exercise. And then there are also validators for CSS. So once you start writing CSS code, you're going to want to validate your CSS as well. But for right now, we're going to focus on the HTML. Now, if you look in your IDE, in your editor, you may see that some of the tags aren't colored in the way that you would expect them to be. And I'm just going to get rid of one of these quotes, for instance, so it's really obvious. You can see as soon as I get rid of the quotes on the value for the href attribute, a lot of my code turns red. In most editors, red is an indication that there is some sort of issue. So if you do see red in your code, it's probably a problem and you're going to want to resolve it. Now, sometimes you may be able to just go ahead and realize where the problem is. If not, a validator can help you find these. So let's just leave this page as is for right now. And I'm just going to save this and show you really quick in the browser before we jump into the validator. So here's my page, and if I refresh, there really is no difference. So even though there is an issue in that I got rid of one of the quotes on this value right here, when we look in the browser, visually, we don't see a problem. Now, if I try to click on this link, then I'm going to have a problem. So that obviously is another indication. But let's see what we can discover by simply using the validator. There are quite a few validators out there. One of the ones that I like is the validator from W3. So it's just validator.w3.org. And you can validate in several different ways. You can validate by entering your URL. You can validate by uploading your file. Or what I generally find to be the easiest, if my web page is not hosted, is to validate by direct input. So that's what we're going to do here. I'll jump back into my code editor, and I'm just going to select all of my text by using Command A or Control A, depending on your operating system. I'll come back into the validator, and I'm just going to paste this code in. So here is all the code. It gets pasted in here. I'm going to click check, and you can see that it's going to find quite a few errors. So you can see errors found while checking this document as XHTML 1.0 transitional. And I have 15 errors, which sounds like a lot. And then there's also some warnings. A lot of times the errors are going to compound on top of each other. So if it says 15 errors, you might just have like 5 errors. And once you start fixing them, these things are going to go down. If you scroll down a little bit on the page, it's going to give you some information. Now, some of this information is going to be helpful, some not so much. There will be a section that's going to give you potential issues. Generally, these things are probably not things that you need to worry about too much, but it is always worth, checking them out. And these error message have to do with the fact that I have no character encoding. And if we look back in our HTML, I actually do have my character encoding, so that's a little weird that it's giving us that error message. The reason we're getting that message is because there's some other problems, which we'll see very shortly. So I'm going to scroll down to where it has the validation output 15 errors. And it just kind of starts top down from the page. So it's going to tell me line 7, column 65, there's no attribute char set. Okay, and then it gives me a little snippet of the code. So a lot of times when you read through the errors, they're going to seem a little cryptic. They're not going to be overly obvious. So what I recommend you do is think like a detective. There is some really helpful information here. We know that this problem is occurring on line 7, and it's something to do with the char set attribute. So if we go back to our code and we look at our page, here's line 7 right here. And if I look, here's the char set. Okay, so what doesn't look right in this line of code? It didn't tell me exactly what the problem was, but the problem is that I have quoted things that aren't to be quoted, because the character set actually is part of the content attribute. It's a little funky how it does that, but this should actually be a semicolon, and then we don't need this quote either. So this is how this line should be. So as soon as you find something that is problematic, you're going to want to correct it, and then I generally select all of my code, I copy it, and I go right back into the validator, and I'm just going to select all of this code and delete it and repaste in my new code, and then I'll click the revalidate button. So now you can see that I've gotten rid of one of the errors. I'm down to 14 errors, so that's great. And if we scroll down to the error section, first of all, you can see that it has some notes here, and then we no longer have that error. So we were able to solve that particular error. Now, the next error I have, line 18. An attribute value specification must be an attribute value literal unless short tag yes is specified. You might be thinking, what the heck does that mean? I do not understand that. Not a problem. This stuff is kind of cryptic, but get the information that is meaningful. Line 18, something to do with an attribute, and it looks like it's highlighting this p tag right here. And sometimes if you go right here and you hover over, you can see it says position where error was detected. So this is super helpful. I know that there's a problem right here in my code. So if we go back to line 18, so here's my line 18, and this is the error that I just consciously made. I got rid of that set of quotes right there, right? So we're missing our opening quotes. So if I just go ahead and add that, you can see that brackets now is much happier. It's not displaying this text as being read any longer. And I probably fixed my problem. So I'm going to select everything, copy it, jump back into the validator. I'll put in my new code right here, and then I'm going to go ahead and click revalidate. So now we went from 14 errors to 11. So just by fixing that one error, I was able to resolve some of the other errors. And this is the reason why I encourage you to check after you fix every single thing, because it might tell you that you have 10 errors and you might fix 2 things, and then all those other errors are just going to be gone. All right, our next problem, line 20, required attribute alt not specified. And you can see if I hover right here, this is where the problem was detected. So this has something to do with missing an alt tag. So if we go back into line 20, here's my image tag right here. And lo and behold, I do not have an alt tag. So I'm going to need to add my alt tag. So I'm going to say alt equals, and we'll just say bird pecking. And we'll save that. Let's select that, copy it all. We'll jump back into the validator. I'm going to select all of my code right here, and I'm just going to get rid of it and repaste in the revised code, and I'll select revalidate. Now we're down to 10 errors. So let's scroll down a little bit. Our next error right here is also on line 20, and it says there is no attribute herf. Okay, so this is telling me exactly what the problem is. This is just a simple spelling error. So if we look right here and we see on line 20, so I need to look where there's the href attribute, and you can see that it's just a spelling error. So this should actually be href, not herf. So again, really common problem. Somebody might just mistype something, and not notice it right away. And as you guys might have noticed, that doesn't affect the actual web page and how it looks, right? It would only be problematic when we actually click that particular link, wherever that might be. So when we try to click the link, then we get the error message. So let's go ahead and let's paste in our revised code. Let's revalidate the page. And now we're down to 9 errors. So we'll scroll down a little bit. The next one is also on line 20, and it says document type does not allow element P here, missing one of object, applet, map, iframe, etc. So again, this might not be super meaningful to you. So let's check the line number, and it has something to do with the P tag. So here's line 20. Here's my opening P tag. And if we go ahead and look at this on first glimpse, it might look fine. But if you look carefully, when you have a P tag, it should always be paired with its closing tag, at least with XHTML. So this one doesn't have the closing tag, and that's actually why this P tag down here is appearing red, because it's expecting another closing tag, like the opening and closing tags aren't paired. So if we just make this into a closing tag right here, then we should resolve that particular issue. So now I have the opening tag and the closing tag. And it looks like this might be from something else. So we'll just have to wait until we get here to figure that out. But let's select all of the code, go back to the validator. We'll go ahead and paste this in, and I'm going to revalidate. And now we're down to 3 errors. So we went from 9 to 3. And you can see that that problem was compounding. So that's why I really tell you to just not keep going through all of the errors, because if you just keep going through them line by line, some of the stuff it's going to tell you are because of the previous problem, and they're not going to make any sense, and you're not going to really be able to resolve them. So just hit it one problem at a time. So our next problem, line 24, end tag for A omitted. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. If we go down here to line 24, here's my opening A tag, but I don't have a closing A tag. And that's why brackets is kind of giving me some problems. And that's also why this whole area is a link, right? Because I don't have the closing A tag in there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just make my closing A tag. And once again, we'll copy all of this. If we save the page and refresh, you can now see that only this little bit of code is a link, which is what we want. So we were able to visually resolve that. And if we come back to our validator and paste in our code and revalidate, we should now be rid of that specific error. So now we have 2 errors. So let's come down here. So we have a line 26, cannot generate system identifier for general entity cop. Okay, so it doesn't understand what that means. And this bit of code should actually be making the copyright symbol, but I purposely left off part of the valid code so that we could see what the error was. So this problem is actually that this should be copy like this. Okay, so ampersand copy and then semicolon, that's going to create the copyright symbol. And just in the interest of saving time, I'm not going to put the code back in because I know that this is an isolated situation. You can see that it is telling me that there's another problem around this same thing, okay? And actually all of these problems have to do with that same thing. So this is a great example of what I was talking about. Like if I fix this one thing, it's gonna give me other errors, but they're all related to that one thing. So I'm gonna come in here, I'll copy everything again, we'll come back to the browser, and let's just paste this in, and we'll click revalidate. And now, lo and behold, our document was successfully checked as XHTML transitional. So that's great. We have one warning. The warnings are not something that I would normally worry about too much. If you want to read through them, you know, perhaps there's something you can resolve, but the warnings are sometimes something that you're not going to be able to resolve. And right now it's just letting me know that it's assuming the UTF-8, like this is not important to us. All right, so now our page is validating and everything looks good in regards to how our page is working. what I do want to encourage you to do is make sure that you test all of the links on your page, because even though it passes validation, this page looks okay, there might be some other problems. So I'm going to go through and start clicking on my links, and when I do so, darn it, the about page was not found. So this passed validation. I know that the code is technically correct, but I might have some other issue. So in this case, my issue is that I named the page About Us, but I linked to a page called About. So this really needs to go to aboutus.html. When I make that change and we save and we refresh, now if I click this, it does take me to the About page, and I can go back now to my home page, and I'll just go through the rest of the links and just test them out. So now you know about validating your page. You know that it's super important. And if you guys are in my class, I expect you to validate every single page that you build. So this is just going to become part of your development process. You will always validate your pages, and your goal is to try to ensure that your page is always going to pass validation. This will help you find errors in your page. It'll help you to code more cleanly and make sure that your page is well structured. It is worth noting that there are validators, as I mentioned, for HTML5 and for CSS. If you just go ahead and Google HTML5 validator, W3 has a validator for that as well. And actually, it's going to be the same validator, but as soon as you load a file that is in HTML5, the results are going to look slightly different. And then we also have a CSS validator, and there's lots of places that do this. I usually just use the first link, which is W3, and the CSS validation is going to look a lot like the HTML validation. It just says CSS validation. So once again, you're going to input in your CSS and you'll check it, and it's going to give you feedback as to if your code is correct or not. So happy coding, and now you know how to make sure that your code is completely valid.